Welcome to Live at 9. Today is Wednesday, the 19th of January 2011. We have a very special and interesting Live at 9 tonight. It's the whole focus on why Christians should stand up and support Israel and the Jewish people. And here's your opportunity to learn more about how you can get involved in standing with Israel and the Jewish people, particularly at this time of trouble when Israel is facing delegitimacy, demonization of both Israel and the Jewish community from academics, from the media, from politicians, from governments around the world, from trade unions, and Jewish students on university campuses are facing a horrendous time, even in this country. So tonight I'm joined by my special guest, Paul Charney, who is the Vice Chair of the Zionist Federation. Paul, welcome to the programme tonight.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have a Jewish person on the programme to represent the Jewish community. It's fantastic. And also joined by Robin Benson, who's quite familiar to us on Revelation, Assistant Director of Christian Friends of Israel. So welcome to the programme. And I just think it's so incredible that here we are, you know, it's in 2011 and we're joined where Christians and Jews can come together to stand with Israel and stand with the Jewish people in solidarity. And yes. I think that's an incredible witness to the world. So for me, it's an absolute pleasure to do this interview. I mean, first of all, Paul, can you tell us what Jewish life means to you and some of your early movements? I mean, you're now Vice Chair of the Zionist Federation. That's right. How did you get involved in the Zionist Federation, and how important is your Jewish identity to you?
Well, very important, which is why I'm in the position I'm in. It's an important ideology, it's an important statement, it's an important view to get across, the Zionist view, to Britain and to the rest of the world. And Israel doesn't necessarily do that without our help and your help and support. Jewish ideology, for me, I was born Jewish. I wear my religious identity on my sleeve. I have always been part of a Jewish community, whether it be in Israel or whether it be out of Israel. And I think it's important to be proud of that and to assist where Israel and Jewish community needs that assistance.
I mean, you were saying before the programme that you served in the IDF. What was it like to serve in the IDF? That's about 3 years military service, isn't it?
That's right, that's right. I did a little bit longer than that. I was an officer in a tank platoon, and for me joining the IDF was once again a belief in ideology, in the ideology of both Zionism and the Jewish community, and democracy, and a lot of the liberal ideologies that we all hold today. Israel stands up for those ideas in a very difficult part of the world where those ideas are not respected, those ideas are not held, and we want to be there to show that part of the world that it's important. So I joined the IDF, and it's an interesting place. I think you see what the true essence of Zionism is by being in the army.
No, I'll probably come on to you on that one a bit later. It's a fascinating issue. And Robin, I mean, for the viewers who don't know you, you know, how did you become a Christian, and where did your love for Israel and the Jewish people stem from?
Well, I became a believer in my late teens. I come originally from Northern Ireland, from a country farming community. I've been brought up in the church all of my life, involved in church life up to here. But in my late teens, through an evangelistic coffee bar back in the mid-70s, they were all the rage for reaching young people. I went along with some of my cousins on a particular Sunday night back in January in the mid-70s. This little tubby, lively, Liverpudlian evangelist was there speaking on 2 successive weekends. And on the first Sunday night, I didn't go the Friday, Saturday night. That's a long story. Don't need to go into it. First Sunday night, I went along, I sat and I listened to what this guy had to say, And by the end of the time that he finished speaking, the only way I can describe it to you, I felt that God had gotten me into a corner. He had shown me, you know, that for all my religious involvement in church life, it was just an outward show. It was a facade. And that there needed to be something much deeper at a heart level. And I really felt the only way that I'm going to get out of this is to yield, is to give my life over to the Lord Jesus. So I did it that particular Sunday night. Now, a couple of years later, 1 year later, I actually had to take time off work. I had chicken pox, and during that time I read 2 or 3 books, you know, you're lying in bed, not much else to do, that sowed a seed thought in my mind that God had not finished with the Jewish people, that he still had a purpose for them as events unfold. And over the years that has been stronger or weaker, depending on whether there are other people around me who held to the same understanding, the same view. And then after, you know, in the midst of a period of unemployment a few years ago, someone who's now a fellow worker, she and I attend the same church. She approached me one day and said, would you like to come and volunteer, come into CFI, Christian Friends of Israel, and help stuff the envelopes for the monthly mailings? And that sort of plunged me, you know, like into the deep end, into the whole topic of Israel, God's purposes, what God was about in Israel and the Jewish community. And I also, at that point, obviously came into contact with the then Deputy Director of Christian Friends of Israel, Jeffrey Smith, who is the one who's really pioneered this linkage between CFI and the ZF and the Jewish community over the last few years.
Wow, that's quite an incredible story. Paul, you talked about earlier Zionism and how much Zionism means to you. What does the word Zionism mean, and also what it's a word and its ideology has come under severe attack in recent years. Can you define what the word Zionism means, and also a brief history of the Zionist movement?
Sure. The word Zionism is, as you mentioned, ideal and ideology for the Jewish people to live in a Jewish state in Israel, its historical homeland. Historically, Zionism has been a movement for many centuries. But in its modern form, we had people like Theodor Herzl and prominent Jewish people in Europe who recognized that the Jews are not safe unless they are living in a Jewish homeland in Israel. This was the late 19th century, where we saw much anti-Semitism and pogroms in Russia, Eastern Europe, and other parts of Europe. And the modern form of the Zionist ideology was born. It was born with the view for Jews to return to a homeland, a safe haven of sorts, and dedicate a life to Jewish practice in Israel, what is currently Israel. And that took 50, 60, 70 years until the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, where that ideology became practice and became real. And hence we have the State of Israel, which emboldens that.
But also, wasn't it interesting at the time, because you had 2 different strands of Zionism occurring at the same time. You had, you know, Theodor Herzl, who was a very prominent Austrian journalist at the time, working for a very prominent newspaper in Paris. Was the officer Dreyfus, who was a leading officer in the French army, and he was then accused of a crime that he didn't commit, and France at the time was considered the most cosmopolitan of all the nations on the earth, and then he really felt that the only safe haven for the Jewish people was to have a Jewish state, and so that really touched the Jewish intellectuals around Europe. But at the same time, because of the programs going on, you have the first wave of Aliyah Jewish people from Russia who went to the land of Israel, which was a province of the Ottoman Empire then, to try and build up the kibbutz movement. So you had that ideology at the time, but also on the ground you had actually Jewish communities building the kibbutzes and the agricultural farms and what have you in a simultaneous process. I mean, the more you explore
but you also, from to put in, you also had from the Christian side, you have this restorationist movement that has been part and parcel of the church going back to the time of Oliver Cromwell, and you know it's waxed and waned over the centuries. But you had key leaders in the church like Spurgeon, the Wesleys, and others who recognized that God still had a purpose for the Jewish people. And you had William Heschler, who was a close associate of Herzl and was an advisor in some senses in the background and part and parcel of the birth of this Zionist movement. So you know the church has been there in the background holding to this view, you know, for all of that time. And then when Herzl came along, it was like there was a blossoming and a beginnings of this new movement that eventually saw the state of Israel come into being.
I think 1860, I think Christ Church was built to help facilitate the return of the Jewish people to their ancient homeland. You know, Paul, can you, before we go to a clip that explains the Zionist Federation, you know, what is the Zionist Federation and what is the work that they do?
Well, you touched on it when you mentioned that the word and ideology of Zionism has been hijacked by people who don't believe in Western ideology. The Zionist Federation was established in the late 19th century along the lines of when the Zionist movement itself was formed. Zionist Federation of Great Britain then became a representative body of the Jewish people for the Zionist movement, and culminating in an acceptance by the British government and Lord Balfour particularly of the requirement and necessity for a Jewish state, and that was promised. The Zionist Federation continued to work alongside and represent the Jewish community in this ideology all the way through to 1948 and the creation of the state, and all the way through to today. Whenever Israel is in need, then the Zionist Federation is here to stand up for Israel, to explain why and how Israel does what it does, and all the good things about Israel, all the research, the scientific and the biological, and all the new developments that Israel provides for the world is a whole side which most people don't see and most people don't know. And the Zionist Federation is here to be a mouthpiece in the UK for Israel, for all the wonder that it does in the world.
So we now have a clip to go, which will give you some insight into the work of the Zionist Federation.
Zionism is the embodiment of the dreams and aspirations of the Jewish people through centuries and generations to go back and establish a home of their own where they would control their own destiny.
Delegitimization of Israel has reached crisis levels. Every day, the Zionist Federation is having to challenge lies and inaccuracies used to denigrate Israel. We bring top speakers to the UK all through the year to inform the Jewish community and make them better advocates for Israel, and more importantly, to put them in front of non-Jewish audiences.
We just have to follow the line that, you know, Israel is bad, the occupation is bad, and this is how we want to cover the conflict. Please don't confuse us with the facts.
We send them into Parliament to speak to MPs, we send them to university campuses all over the UK, and we also put them in front of the media. We regularly produce a variety of concerts for Israeli artists here in the UK, and it's a big part of our strategy to show the breadth of Israeli society above and beyond the politics and the conflict. We are the only organisation holding events such as Science Days in the London and Manchester Science Museums. This, of course, reaches thousands of sixth formers just before they leave for university.
I run Israel Connect, which is the Young ZF. We focus on educating and training young people in the UK and Europe. As the largest grassroots pro-Israel activist organisation in the UK, we organise effective demonstrations at short notice when needed.
Public opinion counts. We have had a lot of results. Our campaigns make a real difference.
The challenges in 2010 are enormous, and I feel that the Zionist Federation, like always, will be on the front line in countering those challenges in the year to come.
Zionism is a word we can all be proud of. No one in the UK is doing more to promote Israel than the ZF.
Okay, welcome back to Live at 9. Robin, can you tell us, the viewers, a little bit more about the history of cooperation between the Zionist Federation and Christian Friends of Israel, and why you value this relationship?
The linkage goes back to Jeffrey Smith, our former assistant director, and then who became director in the last few years. And he and others within the Christian community felt that there actually was a need to go to specific places where major anti-Semitic incidents had occurred and lead services of repentance. You know, lead the local community. So when they went to Bury St Edmunds, they went to York over a period of time, and I think my understanding is that was the beginnings of the linking into the Jewish community. And then Jeffrey just started to develop a relationship with the leadership of the ZF, and just over a period of time it became obvious that there actually needed to be visible demonstrations of the unity that there is between the two communities. And so the lobby is one of those visible, it's probably the most visible demonstration of the two communities working together. Now, my understanding is that today the Jewish community, because it's in metropolitan areas predominantly, can feel very beleaguered and isolated. You know, they're getting it from all sides. And so this is an opportunity, with the lobby in particular, for Christians to come alongside the Jewish community and say, we stand shoulder to shoulder with you on this particular issue or these particular issues. There's been a progression of things over the last few years that we've gone to speak to our MPs about. But it is probably, I think, for the Jewish community, one of the most visible demonstrations of the fact that within the Christian church, there are thousands of Christians who are willing to put their heads above the parapet and say, you know, you're not alone, that we are with you, and you're not going to be left alone, even though you may feel it with all the, you know, the muck that is being thrown at Israel and the Jewish community here in the UK and worldwide.
Yeah. And as a channel, Robin, you know, we feel the same.
Yeah, I know you do. I mean, and that's the great thing about the opportunity to work, you know, with you guys on something like this.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we thank you for that.
No, the honour is ours, Paul, because all that we have, you know, as Christians, and we need to get this into our heads, that all that we have as Christians, we owe to the Jewish people. Anything that is value within the Christian church today, we owe to the Jewish people. Period. You know, and so the honour is ours to be able to work with you.
Oh, yeah. I think we'll express those views. We've got a clip now that highlights a lot of the great work that the Christian Friends of Israel are doing in their work with the Jewish community and with Israel.
We saw the need for some fresh expression of Christian support for Israel and felt the name Christian Friends of Israel was a very appropriate title, because what Israel wants more than anything else are friends. And the concept of Christian friends is those who join themselves with God's purposes for Israel, who identify with their calling, with their problems, with their life, and friends are those who actually stick with another person regardless. And so we try to oppose anti-Semitic attitudes and teaching and all this mess of bad media presentation. Yeah, it's a battle, and it's an intellectual battle, an information battle, a spiritual battle, and also a practical battle in getting the help to needy people.
I think Christian Friends of Israel is very important, because we need to recognise that for the last 2,000 years there has been immense hostility towards the Jewish people from the Christian community, and what we're here to do is to undo that, in a sense, and show true Christian love for the Jewish people. And that's what Christian Friends of Israel is doing. It's doing it here in the UK, it's doing it in Jerusalem, it's doing it in various different parts around the world. I think the reason why people want to be part of Christian Friends of Israel is because God has given them a heart for the Jewish people and for Israel in some way or other. And then they realise that they need to be able to express that in some practical way, and so they want to receive more information and they want to be able to support the Jewish people, which we're able to do.
We were there on the day of the when Ahmadinejad was speaking at the UN. We were there as a delegation of protest to present a letter calling, among other things, for the release of the abducted Israeli soldiers who were captured in 2006.
Well, basically the letter was to show considerable displeasure and disquiet at the way in which the president of Iran has been conducting his affairs and his references to Israel, and generally in terms of world peace.
We feel that the present action of the Islamic revolutionary government are flagrantly breaching human rights and are not giving the people in Iran, the vast majority of the people, their voice to be heard in a democratic fashion.
We've come here to stand with our Jewish friends as partners, and with one of the MPs who stands very strongly with Israel. And we've come here really as partners and as brothers.
Welcome back to Live at 9. Paul, in particular, I mean, this is a historic occasion, really. It's an opportunity for the viewers who are watching, who have a love for Israel and the Jewish people, to actually get involved and show and demonstrate that support for Israel. And that's why I think it's a fantastic opportunity. Can you tell us what led to the breakthroughs within the Zionist Federation, its relationship to the Christian community, and why Christian support, particularly in the forms of lobby MPs, is so important?
Well, firstly, I have to say I'm humbled with Robin's words and with your support, and it certainly highlights the close relationship that we have. We've been involved as organisations, as people, together for a number of years now. I know at university in the UK, I had a number of Christian friends who would openly discuss and join in with me in what would be political debates at that time with non-believers. For us it's very important. It's very important to know that we're not the only voice, the only Zionist voice. It's not just a Zionist and Jewish ideology, but it is a democratic, liberal, it's an open ideology which we believe in. For us, it's very important.
And Robin, here I got a copy of the flyer here.
Yeah. Can
you tell us about when the lobby is, and how the viewers can get involved in lobby? I mean, I went last year, and I've got to say it was very impressive. Yes. Seeing the number of different MPs coming out from all political parties and all political persuasions, coming out and saying, look, you know, thank you for doing this, thank you for standing with us, thank you for standing with Israel and the Jewish community. Well,
the details are that next Wednesday we will be lobbying MPs in Parliament, and if we're taking 3 topics. I don't know whether you want to discuss that now or leave that till a bit later.
Yeah, we can discuss those, yeah.
So we are going to lobby MPs on the story. I mean, I have to say that it is a story, but the story that is circulating in the media at the present time, that there is a possibility of an official Hamas office being recognised in the UK, probably here in London, which is just unbelievable, seeing that every country in the European Union so far says that Hamas is a terrorist organisation. This is ridiculous. So we're going to be lobbying MPs about that. We're going to be lobbying MPs about the increasing demonisation and delegitimization of Israel, but with particular reference to what is going on in university campuses and the way that Jewish students are, verbally and physically abused often at political meetings. And we're also going to be lobbying on the whole issue of the increasing persecution of Christian minorities in Muslim-majority nations, with particular reference, obviously, to the Middle East. Now, this is something actually that the Jewish Board of Deputies recently issued a statement on, voicing this concern. And the pre-lobby information pack has actually been produced by a Jewish educational organisation, the Israel Project. So this, we're saying this is something that the Jewish community is also concerned about. We're concerned about it too, obviously. But so these are the three main topics. And if folk want to, if you're from the Christian viewership of this program, and God touches your heart, and you feel, yes, this is something that I would like to do, and comes and stands shoulder to shoulder with the folk from the Jewish community who will gather in London next Wednesday. I think you will see on the screen at some point there's a contact number for CFI. There's also an email, particularly relating to the lobby, that you can send an inquiry into. We'll get back in touch with you and give you some more information. If you happen to be from the Jewish community and you're watching this program, then I would encourage you to get in touch with the Zionist Federation. They'll give you the details that you need to know.
Yeah, very good. One of the first issues you said that you're discussing at this lobby, and to really bring awareness to members of Parliament, is the proposal of a Hamas office in London. Can you tell us about this development and why it has to be opposed?
Yes, this is a very concerning issue. As Robin mentioned, Hamas is an organization which has been recognized by the EU as a terrorist organization. We believe that the Israeli government have forewarned and officially told the UK government that there is a fronted Hamas organization based in London, which is not just raising money, but is making aware Hamas's ideology, bringing in speakers and essentially assimilating all the forms of information that Hamas and Iran believe in within the UK. This is something which is very worrying. It's a worrying development. It's something that the UK and the security force in the UK need to be aware of and need to do something to break it down. One of the major problems we have as Jewish people in that part of the world is not necessarily a military problem, it's an ideology problem, it's an educational problem. And for the UK government to allow an ideology, an organisation with those ideologies and that education format to be able to freely discuss and bring its information and bring its ideas in London is quite worrying.
Yeah. I mean, the forces who have tried to militarily oppose Israel, and some of them are in the process of rebuilding all that they need to launch further attacks, have learned that there is also, you can use information as warfare. And they are honing their skills with money supplied by all sorts of sources in the Middle East. And the problem is that this front group here in the UK are recognized as being a Hamas front. I mean, it's there in black and white, and yet they're getting away with this. And the sad thing about all of this is that the UK is now recognized by just about everybody who understands what's going on as one of the chief sources of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel propaganda in the world today, never mind in the Western Europe, in the world. And that is a terrible slur on us as a nation, that we have allowed things to get to that state.
I mean, to echo very much what you're saying, Robin, that the Hamas Charter itself, it's a document that not only calls for the destruction of the State of Israel, but actually calls for the destruction and annihilation of the Jewish people,
That's right.
which amounts nothing to genocide.
Yes.
So maybe you guys can, maybe both of you can answer, why in this country with such a proud history of democracy and freedom and liberty, are we allowing Hamas to have an influence here, or even have a presence here, even if it means in a disguised form or in a pseudonym name, that allows this ideology of hatred to spread around the world? Because this is nothing but Nazism. There's no difference between the ideology of Hamas and that of Nazism. So surely, you know, if it was say a Nazi organization, a far-right organization that was establishing an office here, preaching the views and the ideology of the Third Reich, everyone would be up in arms. But why are we not seeing that same reaction against Hamas?
Well, in my opinion, the UK and the Western world are playing catch-up with regards to this ideology. Israel has been living in the area and the region for the last 5, 6, 7 decades in dealing with this ideology particularly. Yeah. And I understand it's a war of ideology as well as a military campaign. The UK have only recently, in the last decade or two, begun to understand that in order to win hearts and minds, it needs to start at home. It's not enough to go across the world to win hearts and minds. You need to start at home. You need to look what's happening in your own backyard. And I think there is an element of the UK feeling a little bit possibly fearful, possibly overwhelmed with what is becoming a very large, major problem in this century.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I would want to put a sort of biblical slant on this as well. I mean, I know I'm sort of treading on eggshells going down this particular route, but, you know, for Christians who have an understanding of the Scriptures, and particularly the New Covenant Scriptures, you know, there are Scriptures that talk about, toward the end of days, that there will be this great delusion that is, you know, comes upon political leaders, the church, and just, you know, the man in the street. And there are those of us who feel that what is going on to some degree is evidence of this delusion, because you cannot, when you actually sit down and look at the different groups that have allied themselves, you know, in this anti-Israel stance. I mean, in a normal society, they would not work together. So from our perspective, there has to be a spiritual dimension to this. That you cannot explain away, that it is there, and that the enemy of God is at work in deluding these people and actually drawing them together. I'm not trying to be apocalyptic, I'm just saying that this is also part of the equation, that we need to recognize that this is actually a spiritual battle for the heart and soul of the Jewish people, but for actually the heart and soul of Judeo-Christian civilization. Yeah. And looking out and reading the endless amounts of negative stuff that pours in from all of these sources, you begin to wonder how much longer this can go on before we just, you know, sink beneath it. It is becoming so strong and so negative.
Yeah, I mean, I had a very special memory. I went to Washington in '99 and met some incredible guys who later on became, you know, presidential advisors in the Bush administration, what have you. And one was a fantastic Orthodox Jew who worked in the Pentagon, and I had a meeting with him, and you know, a guy full of wisdom. And you know, and this is why, you know, for you Christians, this is why the Jewish people are so important. He describes the Jewish people as being like the canary that was put down the mine shafts. That once, if there were any dangerous gases and the canary would die first, it would provide a warning. Yeah. And he said, whatever happens to the Jewish people will also happen to the rest of the world as well.
And this is the old statement, will come for the Saturday people and then will come for the Sunday people. And it is as true today as when it was first voiced, however many centuries, you know, ago it was.
Yeah. We've got a clip now to give you some understanding of the dangers and the ideology posed by the Islamic terrorist organization Hamas.
Using civilians as a means to achieving military goals is considered a war crime and a gross violation of the international laws governing armed conflict. Israel sees the use of human shields not only as a violation of international and national law, but as anathema to the moral and ethical underpinnings of its own society. For Palestinian terrorist organizations led by Hamas, using innocent civilians for both offensive and defensive purposes is not a moral aberration, but a fundamental element of their combat doctrine.
Death in the making. The casings of rockets are forged here, painted, then filled with explosives.
The act of directing attacks against civilians and civilian targets contravenes the principle of distinction, perhaps the most fundamental of the laws of armed conflict. According to this principle, parties must at all times distinguish between civilians and combatants. Moreover, it is strictly prohibited to direct attacks at civilian objects or civilians not taking a direct part in hostilities. Hamas indeed distinguishes between civilians and combatants, but rather than avoiding civilians, it focuses its rocket fire at towns and cities in southern Israel with the aim of causing death, injury, and destruction, and sowing terror among Israeli civilians. In contrast, when dealing with densely populated Palestinian civilian areas, the Israel Defense Forces make great efforts to spare innocent lives, often limiting its military objectives and putting its own troops at increased risk. The IDF uses several methods in order to allow innocent bystanders to evacuate targeted areas. It provides advance notification by airdropping printed warnings. The IDF has established a unit which gives further notification through verbal telephone announcements made directly to local residents. It also sends text messages directly to mobile telephones. When civilians have either been forced or chosen to remain near targeted areas, the Israel Air Force uses precision strikes only against identified targets, as in this image, with minimal, if any, collateral damage to innocent bystanders. Hamas makes operational use of heavily built-up, densely populated civilian areas in the Gaza Strip for the planning, organizing, and launching of rocket attacks. Moreover, Hamas makes use of civilian facilities such as universities for weapons development and systematically uses protected civilian areas such as schools, private homes, hospitals, and mosques for its industry of weapon smuggling, hiding and storage of rockets, explosives, and ammunition, as well as the illicit harboring of combatants. Here we see the entrance to a weapons smuggling tunnel situated directly under a bed in a residential home. Hamas uses the protected status of places of worship to launch rockets from a mosque in the refugee camp of Jabalia. The last image of Hamas firing from a children's school, knowing full well that the IDF normally refrains from firing within a close radius of such sensitive buildings, further demonstrates the fine web of terrorist and civilian infrastructures woven together by Hamas. These examples are expression of Hamas doctrine to integrate both infrastructures, forcing innocent civilians to serve as human deterrents against Israeli attack. Human shielding involves the intentional placement of innocent civilians in harm's way in order to protect the lives of combatants or hide illicit military actions. The forceful sacrifice of an innocent sanctity of life is considered a war crime, but first and foremost, it is a reprehensible violation of the universal concept of human decency. Hamas has fully integrated human shielding as a basic element of its terrorist doctrine, initiating live fire attacks against Israel Defense Forces from within civilian crowds, hiding weapons manufacturing facilities and storage depots in residential buildings and places of worship.
فقال أنا الأمن الإسرائيلي بعد 5 دقائق دخلي أنت أولادك. فقفلت الجوال على الفور واتصلت ببعض الأصدقاء فهرع الأهالي عبر مكبرات الصوت وملأوا سطح المنزل وظلوا حتى الآن يعني مرابطون على سطح المنزل إلى أن يشاء الله سبحانه وتعالى.
Civilians, including women and children, are also exploited by being placed at military targets which Hamas expects to be attacked.
المواطنون وفور سماع نبأ التهديد باستهداف المنزل خرجوا من منازلهم متوجهين إلى منزل الجعابير يشكل دروعا بشرية في محاولة لمنع قصف المنزل.
ولذلك أصبح الموت عند الشعب الفلسطيني صناعة تجيده النساء، تجيده كل من في هذه الأرض. ذلك شكلوا دروعا بشرية من النساء والأطفال والشيوخ والمجاهدين، وكأنهم يقولون للعدو الصهيوني إننا نحرص على الموت كما تحرصون على الحياة.
Despite universal consensus on the status of children as a protected population, Hamas has shown no respect for this fundamental axiom, nor mercy for the children themselves. Hamas begins the process when the children's minds are still pure and unprejudiced, indoctrinating them to blind hatred of Jews and Israelis and a lust for sacrificing their lives in the name of holy jihad. The children are then used as human robots, remotely controlled by Hamas operators, who send them on missions for which they would not risk their own lives. Under the guise and protection of their age and assumed innocence, these children are used as spotters in the front line of combat, used to retrieve weapons from fallen combatants, used to play in Qassam rocket launching areas to deter Israeli attacks. They're used to transport explosives and weapons, and most grievously, they're sent unknowingly with explosive devices in their school bags to be blown up in the vicinity of Israelis. It is clear beyond any doubt that in its armed conflict against Israel and Israeli civilians, Hamas has systematically and deliberately perpetrated the most serious violations of the basic principles of moral decency and international law. It acts in complete disregard for the well-being of civilians on both sides of the conflict, mounting a direct assault not only on the law, but on humanity itself.
Welcome back to Live at 9. It's a very chilling and also very much of a real concept of who Hamas are and what they represent and the ideology behind them. We see those images. I mean, yes. At the moment, there's Hamas in Gaza, and in recent weeks, there's been a renewed missile attack on Israel's southern villages in southern Israel. And also Israel faces a threat from Hezbollah in the north. Apparently, according to a latest intelligence estimates of something like 16,000 missiles targeted Israel's population centres from Hamas and from Hezbollah in the north that now have the means and capacity to reach Tel Aviv, plus also the existential threat that Iran poses to Israel, with President Ahmadinejad calling how he wants to see the Israel wiped off the face of the earth and calling essentially for genocide against the Jewish people once again. But there is a new and more sinister move against Israel and the Jewish people, isn't there? And that's the growing delegitimization of Israel and also the demonization of Israel, which sadly Britain has become a center for it. You know, we're seeing prominent academics are questioning Israel's right to exist. Politicians across Europe are taking extreme anti-Israel positions. Even many EU governments now are beginning to recognise an independent Palestinian state if the Palestinian Authority declare independence. We're witnessing the increase in boycotts against Israeli goods. Even in our own churches, we're having boycotts within the church, and this growing anti-Semitism is emerging within our own communities. Schools and universities have become a battleground where Jewish people feel targeted because they're Jewish or because of their association with Israel. And it very much seems that and also very prominent Israeli figures, politicians and diplomats are fearing coming to the UK in case they fear that they could be arrested on trumped-up crimes of war crimes. This is all being fueled by inaccurate and highly emotive media coverage on the conflict. I mean, the video clip we saw there, I've never seen anything like that on the mainstream media. You know, what can Christians do to stand with Israel and the Jewish people to fight against this delegitimization of Israel?
It's very worrying. In short, Christians, Jews, and everybody who believes in truth should work hard to get the truth out there. Facts have become distorted, truth has become irrelevant, and has been hijacked by ideologies for their own purposes and to serve their own personal needs. Delegitimization has become another tool, has become another arm in the struggle, in the war for Israel's enemies against Israel's, to get rid of Israel altogether. And let me explain to you, just behind the ideology, we've mentioned the ideology a few times, but this ideology is very important to understand. The fundamentalist Islamic ideology is not just to wipe Israel off the map, which is right in the middle of the Middle East, surrounded by Arab and Muslim countries, but it's to change the Western world as we know it. It's all Western ideology. If they succeed in getting rid of Israel, then, as you say, Europe is next, the US is next, and we've already seen attacks on our shores. And these attacks are the ideology that fundamentalist Islam believes in. It's a holy war. It's very difficult to sit down and discuss this with a fundamental Islamic person, because that's what they believe. That's their holy war. Their minds cannot be changed. Whose minds can be changed are moderate Islam, who have also been hijacked by certain elements of fundamentalist Islam, whose minds can also be changed. What we know, what we've come to know, is the left wing in this country, who have once supported the Israeli ideology of self-determination, who once supported the kibbutz movement of going into a hostile area and supporting yourself and making a democracy, a flourishing land, of making the desert blossom with all the people that, and all the tools that you have, and all the assistance that that Israel has had over the years. This is not revered. This is something that Islamic dictators don't want their own citizens to appreciate, to understand, to have, to embolden. And these ideologies have become mixed together. If we took Wales out of the UK and we put it where Israel is, the fight would be the same. It would be a fight against Western ideology. There is a Jewish element, there is a purely Western element, there is a Zionistic element. And they all become confused, which is why when you see activity and delegitimization against Israel, it becomes obscured with anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-Zionistic, anti-Western, anti-globalization sentiment. And it's very difficult to see where everybody has their own point of view. Israel is a liberal democracy who believes in human rights with an accountable judiciary. This is exactly the leftist, the human rights, the democratic ideology that the West should want to see and should support Israel more.
And you know, Robin, you know, we saw the images of Hamas before, and you know, and it's almost as if this is becoming infectious within the Jewish community now. That because of the demonization of Israel and this growing delegitimization of Israel and this constant media barrage of attacks on Israel, that the Jewish community here is beginning to feel the heat as well.
Yes.
You know, what do you feel as someone who's watching this, as a viewer watching now, who's thinking, you know, what can I do? What can I do for Israel? What can I do for the Jewish people? What would you say to them?
Well, first and foremost, don't believe everything that you see on the BBC or ITN or Channel 4 or any of these other media organisations. When it comes to reporting what is going on in Israel, you need to take it with not a pinch of salt, a large dose of salt. And if you know that they are misrepresenting, misreporting, then you need to challenge it. And you need to challenge what's being written in newspapers, whether it's national or local. Don't let them away with it. We have for so long, or it's just a small number of people, you know, constantly, as they would see it, carping on. More of us need to put our heads above the parapet and actually actively get involved in challenging this stuff.
And Paul, how's this affecting the Jewish community in particular, and how's this affecting Jewish students on campus? I mean, I think, what was it, back in '96, I went to University of Manchester, and I was very much involved with the Jewish community there. And the level of attacks then that were coming against the Jewish community was horrific. You had the Islamic Society wanted to ban the Jewish Union because of its association with Israel, even though that was a pretext to actually take over and Islamicize the Union, but you know, that was a hidden pretext. But what is it like now for university students who are Jewish or Israelis that are in our universities?
It's very tough, it's very hard, and it's very sad. Israelis that do come to study in the UK, population, the Jewish population in the UK that do go to universities, find it very hard to wear their beliefs on their sleeve and to support Israel without being attacked, without being attacked verbally, without being attacked physically. And it's just another way to quieten the Jewish and the Israeli voices. There are some other reasons why there is anti-Semitism on campus, but for the most part of it, the Islamic community on campuses don't wish for the truth, for what reality is to be heard. Some are unfortunately led, and led badly by certain imams, by what they see as injustice around the world, without, as you say, finding out for themselves what the truth is.
And Robin, you know, what difference can Christians make by attending this lobby? I mean, surely this is an opportunity now for the viewers watching who have a love for Israel to get involved, to stand with Israel and to stand with the Jewish people, and to actually attend a lobby of Parliament and to actually meet with their MPs and discuss these issues.
We have a lot of new MPs. You know, a lot of the, pardon the expression, the old wood is gone. There are lots of fresh faces, and many of them just need someone to draw alongside them, whether it's in a local constituency office or in Parliament itself, and say, you know, there is another side to this story that you are either reading in your newspapers or on the internet, or you're watching you know, on the televised media. And this is it. You know, this is the other part of the story that you need to, as an MP, start thinking about, taking on board. I am a member of your constituency. I vote, you know, I vote for you, or whatever. But just make them aware of the fact that there are people in their constituency who have a different view from what is the overwhelmingly mass view of how Israel and the Jewish people are painted in our society today.
Yeah. And Paul, why do you think it's so important as well that, I mean, the differences between the Jewish and Christian community is pretty much in a geographical location. You have the predominant Jewish community up in North London, and probably, what, 90% of the UK Jewish population?
That's right.
Or even 95, with smaller pockets in smaller cities and other areas around England. But the Christian community is spread throughout the country, so therefore they can reach MPs that a Jewish person couldn't. I mean, you know, do you have a message for our Christian viewers who are thinking about attending this lobby, and why should they attend?
Well, first of all, those that are coming and helping and supporting, we thank you, and we will stand shoulder to shoulder with you in what you believe in and what we believe in, which is a common belief. For those that are still considering whether I should come, whether I should do it. It's one single lone voice that could make the difference. It's you speaking to your MP, who will stand up in Parliament, who will say the right thing at the right time. We are fighting for inches, and every person counts.
Yes. I remember one of the early lobbies, after one of the early lobbies, Jeffrey Smith had a letter from one of our advocates who had met with a prominent, I won't name the name, but a prominent MP in one particular party. And this was the first time in 7 years of that person being in Parliament that they actually had someone come from their constituent and say, look, I think differently on this issue. And it made the MP sit back and think. Yeah. So you may feel that you are a lone voice. You're not. And you're actually part of a large group who will make an impact on Parliament next Wednesday. But even if you meet your MP in the local constituency office, you are going to have an impact, and they have to listen to you. They may not agree with you, but they will listen to what you have to say and hopefully begin to take it on board.
Yeah. And again, Paul, what's the date of this lobby and how can people get involved?
I'm going to pass that over to Robin, who's involved in the organisation more than I.
26th, next Wednesday, there's a pre-briefing session in a particular place in London, near to Parliament, starting at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then we will move after a light lunch across to Parliament early afternoon. We will be addressed by various MPs right across the party political spectrum, and there'll be an opportunity for people to actually meet with their MP in the Houses of Parliament next Wednesday, the 26th.
And Paul, when it comes down to MPs as well, are they easy to talk to?
It depends who the MP is. Some MPs are open to hearing the views of all their constituents. Some MPs have predetermined thoughts. And those MPs who are not necessarily supportive of Zionism and Israel and the movement, those are the MPs we should be reaching. Those are the MPs that we should be talking to. Those are the MPs which are not necessarily in the surrounding London areas and home suburbs that we need to reach. And with your help, we can do that.
Yes. And I think going down to about the last minute, so I give you the final message to our viewers. I'm looking for a pearl of wisdom here from you, Paul.
The final message is this is going to be a long, drawn-out fight to win hearts and minds, and the only thing that can win it is facts and truth. And it takes a long time for people to understand what those facts and truth are, and we need everybody's help to get that out there, whether it's speaking to newspapers or TV channels, any journalists, talking to people in the street, or any movement. It's about speaking and getting those facts and your opinions out there.
Okay, so we've got 20 seconds left, so I just want to thank you all for very much watching Live at 9, and I just encourage all of you then to get involved in this lobby, go to Parliament and stand with Israel and the Jewish people, and to show them the love that God has given us to them. Okay, and thank you, and shalom and goodbye. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.